My job is yours if you can translate this contract into Chinese, sneered the millionaire CEO at the cleaning lady, but he had no idea about the past she was hiding. The fluorescent lights of the 32nd floor hadn't yet flickered on when Elena Ramirez pushed her cleaning cart into the service elevator. 5:20 a.m. Same time as always. The same harsh chemical smell. The same ache in her lower back. The same faded blue uniform, washed so many times the company logo had practically vanished. At 52, Elena's calloused hands carried much more than rags and detergents. They also carried the silent weight of being invisible. 7 years cleaning the gleaming corridors of Alistair Brandt Imports, one of New York's largest foreign trade companies, and she knew every polished marble tile in the building, every expensive painting on the walls, every executive who walked past her without a second glance. To them, she was part of the furniture, a functional object that ensured the mirrored floors kept shining. Elena was thin, almost frail, with deep brown skin marked by years of hard work and little sleep. Her hair was always pulled back in a tight bun, revealing a face of delicate features that exhaustion tried, but couldn't quite erase. On her back, she carried more than a broom and a mop. She carried the burden of single-handedly supporting 2 teenagers in a cramped apartment in the Bronx. Leo, 17, was studying coding in a free community college program and worked part-time as a delivery app driver. Sophia, 15, was a junior in high school, taking night classes and managing the house during the day. They were good kids. They deserved more than she could give them. That thought was her constant companion, from the moment she boarded the first of 2 subways and a bus to get to the glass tower on Park Avenue, until she finally walked through her apartment door well after 10 at night. On that Tuesday in July, the New York humidity was thick enough to feel like a physical weight. Elena started her work on the executive floor as always. First, the trash cans, then wiping down the glass. Finally, vacuuming the imported carpets that cost more than she earned in 6 months. The smell of expensive coffee began to fill the air as the first executives arrived around 8 o'clock. Impeccable suits, colognes that left a trail, conversations about restaurants where a single dish cost as much as her 3 months' rent. She was cleaning the glass of the large conference room when she noticed an unusual commotion inside. The CEO, Edward Alistair Brandt, had called an emergency meeting with all his directors. Elena knew that man from a distance. White, 45, always in an Armani suit of charcoal gray or navy blue, a gold Rolex catching the light with every flick of his wrist. He walked through the office with the confidence of someone who had never once worried about where his next meal was coming from. Edward slammed his hands on the mahogany table, making the 6 directors jump. That incompetent Chun quit yesterday, 3 weeks before the Chinese delegation arrives. His voice cut clearly through the glass. Elena tried to make herself even more invisible, shrinking as she wiped the glass in circular motions. We're talking about a $38 million contract, Edward continued, gesturing dramatically. The biggest deal in this company's history. And I'm sitting here with a 50-page contract in English that needs to be in perfect Mandarin in 3 weeks, because the Shanghai investors refuse to sign anything that isn't in their native language. One of the directors, a bald man with glasses, dared to ask, "What about the other translators we contacted? $1,000 a page." Edward practically spat the words. $50,000. And they want a 45-day turnaround. Are they suggesting I ask the Chinese to wait? That I show weakness? He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. My reputation is on the line. My empire is on the line. And nobody in this incompetent room has a solution. It was then that Edward turned and saw Elena through the glass. His eyes narrowed. A cruel idea seemed to form in his mind, the kind powerful men get when they need to unload their frustration on someone who can't fight back. A smile began to form on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He walked to the door and yanked it open. "You there?" "Yes, you, the cleaning lady." Elena slowly raised her eyes. 7 years of invisibility had trained her body to cringe, to take up as little space as possible. "Yes, sir." "Get in here." Edward made an imperious gesture. "My board could use a moment of levity on this terrible morning." Elena's stomach tightened. She knew that tone, knew the dismissive gleam in his eyes, but she had no choice. She left her cloth and bucket outside and stepped into the room, feeling the eyes of 6 executives on her. The carpet was so plush under her worn shoes that she almost lost her balance. It smelled of expensive leather and state-of-the-art air conditioning. "You see," Edward began, grabbing a thick stack of papers from the table. "Here we have a 50-page commercial contract. Technical terms, legal clauses, import specifications. It needs to be translated from English to Mandarin, impeccably, by the end of this month." He looked her up and down as if assessing a piece of old furniture. "How about a little proposal? If you can translate this contract by the deadline, I'll give you my job. CO, $100,000 a month. Company car. It's all yours. What do you say? Do you accept the challenge?" The room erupted in laughter. A director with artificially blonde hair laughed so hard she had to dab tears from her eyes. Another executive slapped the table, enjoying the joke. It was the kind of cruel humor powerful people use to remind others and themselves who's in charge. Edward expected Elena to lower her head, mumble an excuse, and scurry away. That's what always happened. What had always happened for the last 7 years. But something different happened on that Tuesday morning. Elena lifted her eyes, not abruptly, not with anger. Slowly, with a dignity that seemed to come from some deep, hidden place within her. Her eyes, dark brown, almost black, locked directly onto Edward's. For a moment, the mask of invisibility she had worn for so long slipped, revealing something no one in that room expected to see. "Resolve. I accept," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. "But I'll need that in writing, sir. With witnesses." The silence that fell over the room was so absolute that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. The laughter died instantly. Edward blinked, thrown off balance. In all his years of building his empire, of intimidating subordinates, of making impossible offers to humiliate those he deemed inferior, no one had ever called his bluff. And certainly no one had ever demanded it be formalized. Are you serious?" His voice had lost its mocking edge. "Perfectly serious, sir." Elena kept her gaze fixed on him. "If you're offering your position in exchange for the translation of this contract, I need it to be documented. It is a formal agreement, isn't it? You always say you only do business with signed contracts. I've heard you say it many times while cleaning your office." The blonde director stopped laughing. One of the executives coughed uncomfortably. Edward felt the ground shift beneath his Ermenegildo Zegna shoes. He had created a situation with no graceful exit. If he backed down now, he would look weak in front of his own team. If he proceeded, he would be formalizing what he considered a cruel prank. Pride won out over prudence. It always did with men like Edward Alistair Brandt. "Very well," he said, his jaw tight. "Arthur, get Mrs. Peterson in here. And Tyler, too. Let's draw up a document. If this woman wants to waste her time, who am I to stop her?" 15 minutes later, a simple but legally valid document was being printed. Mrs. Peterson, the secretary who had worked at the company for over 30 years and had recently retired but still did consulting, entered the room with her stooped posture but sharp eyes. Tyler Ross, a 28-year-old junior lawyer who still held some ideals about justice, followed her in. Edward read it aloud, every word dripping with contempt. "I, Edward Alistair Brandt, CEO of Alistair Brandt Imports, do hereby pledge to transfer my position of Chief Executive Officer to Elena Ramirez, currently an employee in the custodial department. Should she deliver, by July 31st, a complete and technically accurate translation of the commercial contract with the Lijiang Corporation, totaling 50 pages, from English to Mandarin." He looked at Elena with a sneer. "Satisfied?" "Yes, sir. I'll need a notarized copy." Mrs. Peterson, who had been watching everything with growing interest, spoke for the first time. Her voice was raspy from decades of smoking, but firm. "I'll take it to the notary myself, dear. Make sure you're protected." Tyler, the junior lawyer, felt a strange flutter in his chest. Something that felt like hope. He signed as the second witness. When Elena left the room with her notarized copy of the document in hand, the executives started laughing again. Edward opened a $2,000 bottle of scotch and poured around. "A toast," he said, "to the comedy we just witnessed. In 30 days, when nothing happens, this story will become legendary." The janitor who thought she could be CEO. But as the laughter echoed through the room, Elena was walking down the service stairs with something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't exactly hope. It was something deeper, darker. It was a reckoning with a past she had buried, with a version of herself she had sworn never to be again. Because Edward Alistair Brandt had no idea about the secret she had been keeping for 7 years. A secret she hid even from her own children. A secret that shamed her deeply, because it represented everything she had once been, and everything she had lost. Elena Ramirez had once been someone else. A person who spoke 5 languages and taught classical Chinese literature at Columbia University. If you're loving this story of resilience and justice, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Leave a like if you believe everyone deserves a second chance, no matter where they are now. And in the comments, write just one word: respect. Let's continue. That night, Elena got home at 11:15. The apartment was in a narrow building in the Bronx, close enough to the subway terminal for her to walk the last few blocks, far enough that the rent was something she could afford. 3 tiny rooms, plasterboard walls that let in the cold, a bathroom that always smelled of damp. But it was clean, impeccably clean. Elena didn't allow poverty to mean neglect. Leo and Sophia were awake, studying at the plastic table lit by a single bare bulb. When she walked in, they both looked up. Leo, tall and lean like his mother, with the same intelligent dark eyes. Sophia, smaller, quieter, with notebooks spread over used textbooks Elena had bought at a second-hand shop. "Mom, you look different," Leo said immediately. Elena didn't answer. Instead, she placed the notarized document on the table. "I need to tell you something I've never told you, about who I was before you were born." For 2 hours, as the early morning crept in and the July chill bit, Elena told her story. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. She was born in Queens, the daughter of a longshoreman and a seamstress. Brilliant from a young age, she'd won a full scholarship to Columbia. By 23, she was in a master's program in East Asian languages and cultures. At 25, she was defending a PhD on cross-cultural legal translation between English and Mandarin. At 28, she was an assistant professor publishing articles, invited to international conferences. She spoke fluent Mandarin, Cantonese, 3 regional dialects. She had spent 2 years in Beijing on a postdoctoral fellowship. She was respected. She was seen. She was somebody. How did you go from that to? Leo couldn't finish the sentence, but his sweeping gesture, taking in the cramped apartment, her worn-out uniform on the chair, said everything. Elena closed her eyes. This was the part of the story that hurt. "I met your father when I came back from China. Marcus was an engineer, worked in construction. Handsome, funny, he made me feel normal, not like some weird academic who preferred ancient texts to parties." She smiled sadly. "We married Quickly. I was pregnant with you, Leo, that same year. And it was wonderful at first. But your father had an accident at work. A fall from a scaffold. He was killed instantly when you were 6 months old." Her voice broke. "And I couldn't cope. I was pregnant with Sophia, alone with a baby, and the world just got too dark to bear." Sophia reached out and took Elena's hand. "Mom." "Postpartum depression," the doctors said. "But I had no money for proper treatment, no family who could help me. My mother had passed years before, my father had a stroke and was in a nursing home I could barely afford to visit. I started missing work at the university. I couldn't prepare lectures anymore. The Mandarin words, which used to flow so easily, felt like stones in my throat. I'd look at the characters and just see blurs. I lost my position at Columbia, lost my academic credibility. I lost everything." Elena looked down at her own calloused hands. and I convinced myself I deserved to lose it, that my weakness meant I never should have been there in the first place, that I was a fraud, a poor girl from Queens playing at being a professor. So I became a janitor, like a punishment, penance. I swore I would never touch anything related to Chinese again, that I would never again try to be that person. That person had failed. That person had been weak. Leo was looking at her with tears in his eyes. Mom, you're not weak. You never were. I remember you studying with me when I was little, teaching me how to read. You've always been the smartest person I've ever known. And now, Sophia asked, looking at the document, are you going to do this? Are you going to do the translation? Elena took a deep breath. I am. Not for his job, not for the money, though God knows we need it. But because, she paused, searching for the right words. Because maybe it's time to stop punishing myself. Maybe it's time to forgive that 29-year-old Elena who broke under the weight of a tragedy. Maybe it's time to be strong not in spite of falling, but because I managed to get back up. Leo stood up. I'll help. I know some programming. I can build something for you to type the translation. Our computer is old, but it works. And I'll take care of the house while you work, Sophia added. I'll cook, clean, everything. You just focus on the contract. And so it was, in the early hours of a humid July morning in a Bronx apartment, that Elena Ramirez decided to stop hiding. The first 3 days were reconnaissance. Elena not only got hard copies of the contract, Edward had authorized it with a condescending smile, assuming she'd give up in 48 hours, but she also requested digital versions to facilitate term lookup, an excuse that seemed convincing enough. At night, under the dim light of the apartment's single bulb, she opened the document for the first time not as a janitor, but as the scholar she once was. Her hands trembled as she held the first few pages. The contract was dense. 50 pages of technical terms on electronics importation, staggered payment clauses, financial guarantees, customs inspection requirements, penalties for noncompliance, specific legal and commercial vocabulary, references to US and Chinese law, sentence structures that would have to be completely rethought to work in Mandarin. Elena felt something stir inside her, like a dormant muscle being forced to wake up. Painful but also invigorating. She began to take notes, first by hand in school notebooks Sophia used, problematic terms, complex sentence structures, cultural nuances that would need adaptation, the difference between literal translation and functional translation, how to express American legal concepts using Chinese cognitive frameworks. Leo worked for 3 nights straight and built a simple program, clunky but functional, that allowed Elena to type in Chinese characters on the old computer. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. It was all they needed. On the 5th day of work, the first small twist no one expected occurred. Elena was cleaning the hallway near a manager's office when she overheard a conversation between 2 accountants. Can you believe that cleaning lady is actually trying to translate the contract? Carla at the front desk said she saw her with papers full of scribbles. Scribbles, the other replied disdainfully. She's probably using Google Translate and thinks no one will notice. But Carla, the aforementioned receptionist, a black woman in her 40s who had always treated Elena with a distant cordiality, had seen something different. She had witnessed Elena, during her lunch break, sitting on the emergency stairwell, her lips moving as she read the contract. And they weren't English words. It was something else, something that flowed with tones and inflections. Carla didn't say anything, but she started watching. In the executive suite, Edward was growing more irritated. The deadline with the Chinese investors was fast approaching, and he still had no translator. The professionals he'd contacted were sticking to their exorbitant prices and impossible timelines. He was starting to consider postponing the meeting, but that would mean showing weakness. And Edward Alistair Brandt never showed weakness. That janitor, he said to his CFO, a 50-year-old man named Arthur. Is she still keeping up that translation theater? Arthur shrugged. Apparently, but sir, we need a real solution. The investors arrive in 25 days. Without the translated contract, we lose the most important deal in this company's history. Edward slammed his fist on the mahogany desk. I know that. You think I don't know that? He ran a hand through his hair, a rare show of nerves. Contact that translation agency in Midtown again. Offer them more money. Offer them whatever it takes. What Edward didn't know was that Elena was already on page 12 of 50. Working at an astonishing pace, she translated in the dead of night, reviewed during her breaks, and refined when she got home. Mandarin, the language she had sworn never to touch again, was flowing from her fingertips like water finding an ancient riverbed. But she was careful, methodical. Every technical term was checked 3 times. Every sentence structure tested aloud to ensure it sounded natural to a native speaker. She wasn't just translating words. She was translating intent, context, and legal implications. Leo watched in awe as his mother worked. "It's like watching a pianist," he said one night. "Your fingers just know where to go." In the second week, Elena made a discovery that chilled her to the bone. It was 2 in the morning. She was translating the conditions of share transfer section when she noticed something odd. A particular clause, hidden amidst dense legalese, stated that after 18 months from the initial investment, and upon certain performance conditions, the Lijiang Corporation would have the right to acquire a majority stake in Alistair Brandt Imports at adjusted market values. Elena reread it 3 times. Then she pulled up another section of the contract, the one on performance metrics. The conditions set were impossible to meet. Literally impossible. 300% growth targets in 2 quarters, expansion into 12 new markets simultaneously, profit margins that no import company could sustain. She understood with sudden, terrible clarity. The contract was a trap. The Chinese investors weren't partnering. They were buying the company on an installment plan, structured so that Edward wouldn't realize it until it was too late. In 18 months, he would lose everything. And by the structure of the contract, it would be technically legal. Elena sat on the narrow bed in her apartment, the old laptop on her knees, facing a moral dilemma that kept her awake until dawn. Edward Alistair Brandt had been cruel to her. He had mocked her, humiliated her, reduced her to the butt of a joke. Part of her wanted to simply translate the contract as it was and let him face the consequences of his own arrogance. But Elena couldn't do it, because she wasn't cruel, and because, as much as it pained her to admit, she still believed it was better to be who she was, someone who did the right thing, than to become the kind of person he was. On the 14th day, Edward began to get genuinely worried. The CEO was speaking with Arthur in low tones when Charles Mendez entered the office. Charles was the HR manager, a 40-year-old black man who had reached his position through a decade of brutal hard work and impeccable credentials. He recognized something in Elena that the other executives couldn't see. "Sir," Charles said, hesitant. "About the employee, Elena Ramirez." "What? Did she quit?" "Perfect. I can tear up that ridiculous document and—" "No, sir. It's just, she's been seen reading documents in Chinese during her breaks. And from what Carla at reception reported, she's not using an electronic translator. She's actually reading." Edward froze. "What are you implying?" "I did some digging, sir. We have her original hiring documents in HR. Her social security number." Charles took a deep breath. "Elena Ramirez has a BA, a master's, and a PhD in Chinese language and literature from Columbia University. She was an assistant professor there for 3 years. She's published 17 academic papers. She spent 2 years in Beijing on a postdoctoral fellowship." The silence in the room was absolute. Edward felt the floor crumble beneath him. A university professor is cleaning our floors?" Arthur whispered. Charles nodded. "She lost her husband, fell into a severe depression, lost her academic position. That was about 7 years ago. That's all I could find." Edward felt something he rarely experienced. Fear. Real fear. She can actually translate the contract. Based on her academic record, Charles said calmly, she might be the most qualified person in all of New York City to translate that contract. Edward's first reaction wasn't admiration or remorse. It was anger. Anger at being played, at having made a deal he might now be forced to honor, at underestimating someone he considered so far beneath him. She lied, Edward said, his voice cold. When she applied for the janitorial job, she omitted her entire education. That's fraud. That invalidates our agreement. But Charles, who knew more about labor law than Edward imagined, shook his head. Sir, with all due respect, she didn't lie. She has the required qualification for the cleaning position, a high school diploma. There's no law that obligates someone to declare higher education when applying for a position that doesn't require it. And the agreement you made didn't specify that she couldn't have qualifications. It only specified that she needed to deliver the translation. Edward clenched his fists. Then we'll change the agreement. And that's exactly what he tried to do. If this story is moving you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion. Leave your like if you're rooting for Elena. And in the comments, write, justice. Let's see how many of us believe that good always wins. Keep watching. On the 16th day, Elena was summoned to Edward's office. It was noon, an unusual time. She finished cleaning the room she was in, washed her hands carefully, and went up to the 35th floor, where the CEO's office was located. The office was absurdly luxurious. Imported marble floors, a desk of precious wood that looked like it had come from a European palace, leather chairs that cost more than a small car. The windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the city stretching as far as the eye could see, a sea of concrete and glass. Edward was sitting behind his desk, flanked by two new witnesses, a corporate lawyer in a pinstripe suit and a director of operations Elena vaguely recognized. They weren't the same witnesses from the original agreement. Ms. Ramirez, Edward began, his voice formal and cold. We have a delicate situation. We've realized the original agreement was imprecise in its terms. Elena remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her. She knew what was coming. She had anticipated it. You want to change the terms, she said. It wasn't a question. I prefer the term clarify. You see, a translation is one thing. Anyone with a dictionary can translate. But true fluency, real linguistic competence, requires a broader demonstration. He pushed new documents across the desk. Therefore, we are proposing an addendum to the original agreement. In addition to the initial 50-page contract, you will also translate these three other contra. CTS from Chinese to English. They are supplementary documents from the same investors. A total of 80 more pages. This will demonstrate bidirectional fluency. Elena looked at the documents but didn't touch them. Instead, she opened her worn bag and placed something on the marble desk that made Edward go pale. Notarized copies of the original agreement, the notary's stamp clearly visible. I figured you would try something like this, she said calmly. That's why I had Mrs. Peterson notarize not just the signatures, but the full content of the document, dated and timed. I have 3 copies. One is with a lawyer, one is with a local labor rights nonprofit, and one is in my home. The corporate lawyer looked at Edward with a tense expression. Elena continued, the original agreement is clear and specific, translation of the 50-page commercial contract with the Lijiang Corporation, from English to Mandarin, by July 31st. It does not mention an additional demonstration. It sets no prerequisites regarding my education or my method. Only the result. You can't. I can, sir. Elena interrupted, something she had never done in 7 years. And I will. I will deliver exactly what was agreed upon. If you attempt to unilaterally modify the terms, I have legal counsel who has confirmed this would constitute a breach of contract on your part. The penalties are stipulated in labor law, and I would document everything. She paused. Besides, I'm sure the press would find it a very interesting story. Millionaire CEO tries to cheat janitor after making public bet. The silence that followed was as taut as a violin string about to snap. Edward was not used to being challenged. He was not used to losing. And he was definitely not used to losing to someone he considered so far beneath him. Get out, he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. Get out of my office. Elena gave a slight nod, picked up her notarized copies, and left. When the door closed, the corporate lawyer turned to Edward. "Sir, she's right. The document is ironclad. If you try to change it now, you'll only make your position worse." Edward hurled a crystal ashtray against the wall, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. In the following days, Edward didn't give up. He just changed tactics. Elena's workload was drastically increased. In addition to her regular areas, she was assigned to clean 2 additional floors. Her shifts were modified so that she would have to work unpaid overtime or be written up for lack of commitment. Her uniform mysteriously disappeared from the locker room, forcing her to work in a borrowed one that was 3 sizes too big. They were small cruelties, calculated pettiness. Edward spread rumors among the staff that Elena was using Google Translate and trying to fool everyone. He made a point of walking past her in the hallways, commenting loudly about people who try to be something they're not. But Elena had survived 7 years of invisibility. She had raised 2 children virtually alone on a janitor's salary. She had rebuilt her life from the ashes of depression. She was not going to break because of the childish antics of a scared, rich man. For every insult, she translated 50 more paragraphs. For every disdainful look, she refined 3 more pages. For every attempt at sabotage, she grew stronger. Charles Mendez, the HR manager, watched it all with growing outrage. One night, as Elena was cleaning the HR department after hours, he walked into the room where she was working. "Elena," he said softly, "I can help." She looked up, surprised. In 7 years, few executives had ever called her by her first name. "It's the computer, right? For typing the translation." Charles continued, "The one in my office is here all night, after everyone's gone. The password is..." He wrote on a slip of paper, "This, use it. The printer, too. No one has to know." Elena felt tears well up in her eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Charles smiled sadly. "Because I know what it's like to have to work 3 times as hard just to get half the recognition. Because I came from the South Bronx, went to school at night while working during the day, and had to prove myself 1,000 times over while people like Edward just had to be born into the right families." He looked her directly in the eye. "Because when I see you, Elena, I see my mother. I see my sister. I see all the people who never got the chance they deserved. And this time, in this company, in this situation, I can do something. So I'm going to." From that night on, Elena had access to resources that dramatically improved her efficiency. The modern HR computer with a proper keyboard for Chinese characters, the high-quality printer, legal reference books that Charles would discreetly leave on the desk. The translation accelerated. But it was also during this period of intense focus that Elena deepened her analysis of the contract's predatory clauses. The more she studied, the more complicated the picture became. The Chinese investors weren't criminals. They were just extremely shrewd businessmen who had structured a deal that was technically legal but morally questionable. And Edward, blinded by his own arrogance and desperate for capital, had taken the bait completely. Elena spent 3 nights doing something that hadn't been asked of her. She drafted a complete analysis of the contract's vulnerabilities, accompanied by a counterproposal that rebalanced the deal. She used principles of Chinese cultural negotiation, concepts like guanxi, relationships based on mutual trust, and mianzi, preserving dignity and reputation, to structure terms that would be acceptable to both sides. She transformed a colonialist contract into a genuine partnership. "Mom," Leo asked one night, watching her work until 4 in the morning, "why are you doing more than they asked? Why are you saving the company of the man who humiliated you?" Elena stopped typing and looked at her son. "Because, honey, I don't do things for the person who will receive them. I do them for the people who will be affected. That company has 240 employees. People like me. If it goes under, those people lose their jobs. Some of them have been there for decades. They have families, kids in school, dreams." She turned back to the computer. "I'm not going to let them suffer, just because my pride wants revenge." On the 23rd day, Edward received news that the Chinese investors' visit had been moved up. They were arriving in 1 week, not 2. Changes in their international schedule, they claimed. But Edward suspected it was intentional pressure, a negotiation tactic to put him in a more vulnerable position. He called an emergency meeting. The contract needs to be translated in 7 days. Someone find a professional translator. I don't care what it costs. Arthur, the CFO, replied in a neutral voice, Sir, we've tried. The deadlines are impossible. Unless, he hesitated, unless the option of the employee Elena Ramirez is real. Edward felt acid rise in his throat. That's our only solution? To depend on a janitor. To depend on a PhD in Chinese studies. Charles corrected him bravely. Who happens to work as a janitor? Edward had no choice, and everyone in the room knew it. Meanwhile, Elena was on page 47 of 50, working 18 hours a day, sleeping 4 hours if she was lucky, fueled by coffee and toast because she had no time for more. The dark circles under her eyes looked like tattoos. Her hands trembled with exhaustion. But the translation was flawless, and she was 2 days ahead of schedule. Sophia started to cry when she saw her mother's condition. You need to rest. You're going to get sick. Just 48 more hours, Elena whispered, her fingers still typing. Just a little longer. On the 28th day, Elena finished. 50 pages of contract translated with academic perfection. Every technical term verified. Every legal clause precise. Every cultural nuance respected. On top of that, she had prepared her analysis of the predatory clauses and the balanced counterproposal. Everything was professionally printed on high-quality paper she'd bought with the money she had saved to buy new sneakers for Leo. 2 days ahead of the deadline, she walked into Edward's office and placed 3 bound volumes on his desk. The translation of the original contract, her analysis in both Mandarin and English of the identified vulnerabilities, and the counterproposal with rebalanced terms. Edward looked at the documents as if they were poisonous snakes. He didn't touch them. The deadline is July 31st, he said coldly. You're early, but that changes nothing. I still need independent verification that the translation is correct. Of course, Elena replied. Her voice was hoarse with fatigue. I imagine your corporate lawyer specializing in international law, Dr. Mei Lin, would be suitable for this verification? She is Chinese-American, if I'm not mistaken. Born in Shanghai. Edward went pale. How do you know the name of my specialist lawyer? I've been cleaning her office for 7 years, sir. Just like I clean every other office in this company. People talk as if I'm not there. You learn a lot by being invisible. 3 hours later, Mei Lin was in her office, analyzing Elena's translation with an expression of ever-increasing astonishment. Edward and Arthur watched anxiously. Charles Mendez was there too, having insisted on representing the employees' interests. Mei turned pages, murmured in Mandarin, and cross-referenced specific terms in legal dictionaries. Finally, after a full 2 hours of analysis, she turned to Edward. This translation is perfect, she said simply. Not just technically correct, but culturally appropriate. The sentence structures respect the conventions of Chinese legal language. The technical terms are precise. More than that, she picked up the vulnerability analysis. This breakdown of the problematic clauses is absolutely correct. Mr. Alistair Brandt, without this discovery, you would have lost majority control of your company in 18 months. The silence in the room was deafening. What? Edward whispered. Mei explained point by point the traps hidden in the contract, the impossible targets, the disguised share transfer clauses, the gradual, technically legal takeover mechanism. Edward lost more color with every word. But she made a counter-proposal, Mei continued, picking up the 3rd volume. And it's brilliant, truly brilliant. She not only identified the problems but created solutions that preserve the dignity of both parties. This shows a profound understanding not just of language, but of the cultural philosophy of Chinese business. This counterproposal? Mei looked at Edward with newfound respect for the invisible woman who had been cleaning his office for years. Could actually save this deal. And your company. Edward couldn't speak. Arthur's mouth was hanging open. Charles Mendez was trying to hide a smile. Who did this work? Mei asked. This level of expertise is exceptional. The style of translation is, wait. She studied the documents more closely. This pattern of structuring, this approach to cross-cultural interpretation. She looked at Edward. Who was the translator? Elena Ramirez, Charles said before Edward could answer. Employee in the custodial department. PhD in Chinese language and literature from Columbia. Former assistant professor. Published 17 academic papers on cross-cultural legal interpretation. May went pale. Elena Ramirez? The Elena Ramirez who published that seminal paper on Sino-American commercial contracts in 2015? That paper was cited in my master's thesis. She's working as a janitor. For 7 years, Charles confirmed. May looked as if she were about to faint. I need to meet her. Now. And so it was, less than 24 hours before the Chinese investors were due to arrive, that Elena Ramirez, still wearing her worn-out cleaning uniform, was officially invited to a meeting in the executive suite. This story is reaching its most thrilling moment. If your heart is pounding for Elena, leave your like right now. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell because the ending will leave you speechless. Comment. Deserved. Let's show her how much support she has. Stay till the end. The Chinese investors arrived the next morning. 3 men in impeccable suits, led by Mr. Li Wei, the senior partner of the Lijiang Corporation. Mr. Li was about 60, with perfectly combed gray hair and a posture that communicated decades of power and experience. He greeted Edward with a firm handshake, but his eyes were calculati. Assessing. The meeting was held in the Grand Conference Hall on the 36th floor. Edward had prepared an elaborate presentation, complete with financial projections and corporate videos. He was nervous, a rarity for a man accustomed to total control. Gentlemen, Edward began in English, the neutral language of international business. It is an honor to host you. We have prepared the contract as discussed, now translated into Mandarin as per your preference. Mr. Li accepted the bound documents. His 2 associates immediately began to examine them, murmuring to each other in Mandarin. Edward, who didn't speak a word of the language, smiled nervously, waiting. It was then that Mr. Li asked, in fluent Mandarin, "Who did this translation?" Edward blinked. I don't speak Mandarin, sir." One of Mr. Li's associates translated into English, repeating the question. "A specialized consultant," Edward replied vaguely. He didn't want to mention he had relied on a janitor. Not in front of investors who controlled $38 million. Mr. Li studied the documents more closely. Then he picked up the vulnerability analysis and the counterproposal. His eyes widened. He said something quickly in Mandarin to his associates, who replied with equal surprise. "This analysis," Mr. Li said in precise English, looking directly at Edward, "identifies structures we intentionally placed to be challenging. And this counterproposal rebalances the agreement in ways that demonstrate a profound understanding of Chinese cultural negotiation. Concepts of guanxi and mianzi have been masterfully applied." He paused. "Who, exactly, was this consultant?" Edward hesitated. It was Mei Lin, present as the company's lawyer, who answered, "Mr. Li, the translation and analysis were done by Dr. Elena Ramirez, a specialist in Sino-American studies." "Elena Ramirez," Mr. Li repeated slowly. "That name is familiar, very familiar." He turned to his associates and spoke quickly in Mandarin. One of them took out a tablet, typed something, and showed it to Mr. Li. The senior partner studied the screen for a long moment. Then he looked at Edward with a completely different expression, a mixture of confusion and growing disapproval. "Please bring Dr. Ramirez to this meeting. We need to discuss the terms of the contract directly with the person who truly understands it." Edward felt the floor give way. "Mr. Li, that's not necessary, I can." "It was not a request," Mr. Li interrupted, his voice courteous but unyielding. "It was a requirement. We are bringing an investment of $38 million. We require to speak with the person who actually understands what is being discussed." 20 minutes later, Elena walked into the conference hall. She was still in her uniform, She hadn't had time to change. The worn, faded fabric was an absurd contrast to the luxury of the room, to the Italian suits of the men present, to the marble and crystal. But Elena walked in with her head held high. She had translated 50 pages of a complex contract. She had identified traps that corporate lawyers had missed. She had proposed solutions that demonstrated an understanding of two cultures at once. She had nothing to be ashamed of. Dr. Ramirez, Mr. Li stood up, a sign of deep respect in Chinese culture. It is an honor to meet you in person. Elena replied in fluent Mandarin, with an almost imperceptible Beijing accent. The honor is mine, Mr. Li. I hope the translation meets your needs. The hall fell into absolute silence. Edward was pale. Arthur looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. The other executives present looked between Elena and the Chinese investors as if they were watching a tennis match. Mr. Li smiled, a genuine smile, not one of corporate politeness. Your Mandarin is exceptional. Beijing accent, if I'm not mistaken? Did you study in the capital? 2 years of postdoctoral work at Peking University, Elena replied, still in Mandarin. Under the supervision of Professor Zhang Qiming. Mr. Li sank back into his chair, stunned. Zhang Qiming? Professor Zhang Qiming was my undergraduate advisor. In the 90s, he passed away 3 years ago, but he always spoke of the exceptional students he had mentored. You were one of his stars. He mentioned your work on cross-cultural legal interpretation several times. Mr. Li looked around the room, then fixed his eyes on Edward. And this brilliant person, this internationally respected academic, is here wearing a janitor's uniform? The ensuing silence was so heavy it seemed to have a physical substance. Mr. Alistair Brandt, Mr. Li continued, switching back to English but with a noticeably colder tone. Please explain why a woman with these credentials is not leading your international negotiation team. Why is she, instead, apparently working in custodial services? Edward opened and closed his mouth several times. He had no answer that wouldn't make him look like exactly the kind of person he was. Someone who judged human worth by appearances and social standing. I can explain, Elena said gently, saving Edward from the embarrassment she, ironically, had learned to recognize from years of being invisible. I went through a difficult period 7 years ago. I lost my husband, faced a severe depression, and lost my academic position. I needed to work, and cleaning was what was available at the time. I stayed in the job because... She paused, searching for words. Because sometimes we think we deserve to be punished for having been weak. But I've learned recently that surviving is not weakness. Rebuilding is not weakness. And doing a job well, no matter what it is not shameful. Mr. Li studied her with eyes that had seen decades of business, people, betrayals, and rare honesty. You identified the problematic clauses in our contract, he said finally. The structures that, you are correct, were intended to eventually give us majority control of this company. You had no obligation to expose this. You could have simply translated it and let Mr. Alistair Brandt face the consequences. Why didn't you? Elena looked directly at him. Because 240 employees work for this company. Many for decades. They have families, children, dreams. It wasn't fair for them to lose their jobs because of one man's mistakes, even if that man was not kind. To me, doing the right thing doesn't change based on how we're treated. Mr. Li nodded slowly. Then he turned suddenly and completely away from Edward and began speaking directly to Elena in Mandarin. For 45 minutes, they discussed the terms of the contract, her proposal, the cultural implications of certain clauses, and ways to structure a deal that would genuinely benefit both sides. Edward tried to interrupt several times. But I'm the CEO. I need to know what you're discussing. Mr. Li glanced at him with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Alistair Brandt, you had the opportunity to understand the contract. You chose not to do the proper due diligence. You are now at the mercy of the person who actually comprehends what is being agreed upon. He turned his attention back to Elena. Dr. Ramirez, your counterproposal is not only acceptable, it is preferable. It demonstrates the kind of partnership my corporation values. Would you be interested in staying on as a cultural and legal consultant for our Latin American operations? Elena took a deep breath. This was the offer that would change her life completely. Financial freedom, professional recognition, a return to the academic and corporate world she had once known. But she had learned something in those 7 years of pushing a cleaning cart. She had learned about power, about vulnerability, about how systems were built to keep certain people invisible. And if she simply accepted this offer and left everything behind, she would just be replicating the same system. "I accept," she said slowly. "On a few conditions." Mr. Lee raised an eyebrow. "Conditions?" "First, this company creates a scholarship program for low-income employees to complete or begin higher education, fully funded with flexible work hours to allow them to study. Second, my daughter, Sofia Ramirez, who studies business at night, is given an internship position here. Not through nepotism, but on merit. She can take any test, do any interviews you require to prove herself. Third, Mr. Charles Mendez, the HR manager who demonstrated integrity when others looked away, is promoted to Vice President of Human Resources." Arthur let out a disbelieving laugh. "You can't make demands of the investors." But Mr. Lee was smiling. "Dr. Ramirez, these conditions demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership we value. Someone who thinks not only of herself, but of the wider community." He extended his hand. "I accept all conditions, and I'll add one of my own. Your salary will be 5 times what Mr. Alistair Brandt currently makes." Edward shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the marble floor. "This is absurd. This is my company, my empire that I built from scratch. You can't just—" "Mr. Alistair Brandt," Mei Lin interrupted, her lawyer's voice firm and clear. "The agreement you made with Elena Ramirez was in clear terms. If she translated the contract by the deadline, the position of CEO would be hers. She has fulfilled her end of the bargain. Technically, legally, the position now belongs to her. And frankly," Mr. Lee added coldly, "after discovering that you kept an academic of this caliber cleaning floors, someone whose connections and expertise could have elevated your company to international levels, I seriously question your leadership capabilities. My corporation does not do business with men who squander talent out of arrogance." The final showdown had arrived. The entire board, the original witnesses, the lawyer, the Chinese investors, they were all looking at Edward and Elena. The millionaire CEO who had mocked, the cleaning lady who had won, Mrs. Peterson, who had quietly entered the room during the argument, put her hands on her hips. "Edward Alistair Brandt, I've worked for this company for more than 30 years. I saw you come in as a spoiled boy using your father's money to buy your position. And now I see you being outmaneuvered by a woman who has more integrity in her little finger than you have in your whole body." She looked at Elena. "My dear, everyone in this building who pays attention to anything besides themselves knew you were special. The way you cleaned, the organization, that book you sometimes read on your break. I saw the cover, it was in Chinese characters. We've been rooting for you since day one of this ridiculous challenge." Tyler Ross, the young lawyer, added, "The contract is clear. I witnessed it. It was notarized. It's valid. The position of CEO, technically and legally, belongs to Elena Ramirez." Edward looked around the room. He saw only disapproval, disrespect, or at best, indifference. His corporate lawyer was standing with Elena. His Chinese investors clearly respected her more than him. His own board was avoiding his gaze. He had lost. Completely, undeniably lost. "You'll all regret this," he whispered. But it was an empty threat and everyone knew it. "No," Elena said softly. "I don't think we will. I think that years from now, when you reflect on why you lost everything, you might realize it wasn't because I translated a contract. It was because you built an empire on disrespect and underestimation. And those foundations always crumble." Edward walked out of the room. 3 months later, he would resign completely, fleeing to Miami to avoid the tax evasion investigations that arose when the company's new management discovered his other accounting creativities. But at that moment, in that conference room with a view of New York City, Elena Ramirez, 52 years old, her brown skin marked by work, her hands calloused from 7 years of scrubbing floors, received something she had lost so long ago she had almost forgotten how it felt. She received recognition. She received dignity. She received justice. And most important of all, she got herself back. 6 months later, the 32nd floor of Alistair Brandt Imports had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Elena had kept her office on the same floor she had cleaned for 7 years. But now she sat behind the desk of the international consultant, with a view of the city she had traversed on 3 different transit lines every morning for so long. She still wore simple clothes. Not Armani suits, not designer handbags. Slacks from department stores, modest blouses, comfortable shoes. "I don't need a Rolex to know my worth," she once told a journalist who did a FIA tour on her story. The scholarship program had been implemented. 5 employees from the custodial department, including Carla, the receptionist who first noticed Elena reading Mandarin, were attending college. The company paid in full, and their work schedules were flexible to accommodate their studies. Sofia Ramirez was an intern in the International Operations Department, distinguishing herself with an organization and dedication she had clearly inherited from her mother. Charles Mendez was now the vice president of HR, implementing policies that valued competence over connections, merit over privilege. "It's still hard," he admitted to Elena once. "Changing a corporate culture is like turning an ocean liner. It's slow and takes constant effort, but we are turning." Leo had finished his technical course and was working as a junior programmer, but Elena had insisted he not work at her company. "You need to build your own path," she had told him. "Not live in my shadow." Elena still ate lunch with the cleaning crew. She still knew the names of all the security guards, the receptionists, the cafeteria staff. She never forgot where she had been, and more importantly, she never let others forget that dignity doesn't come from a title, but from how you treat others when you have power. The partnership with the Lijiang Corporation was flourishing. Elena navigated cultural nuances with an expertise that had made Alistair Brandt Imports the leading company in U.S.-China trade. Mr. Li became a true friend, visiting New York quarterly and always bringing premium tea from Hangzhou, which they would drink while discussing not only business but philosophy, literature, the differences between the Tao Te Ching and Faulkner. Mei Lin, the corporate lawyer, became a colleague and confidant. "Elena," she said once, "you did something most of us can't. You held onto your humanity despite everything the system tried to take from you. But your value isn't in the job you do today, but in who you've always been and always will be." After Patricia left, Elena stood looking out the window. New York spread out below, so vast, with so much inequality, with so many stories of invisible people cleaning floors, serving coffee, making the city's infrastructure run while remaining unseen. But she had proven something important. She had proven that a story can change. That invisibility isn't permanent. That justice, even when it's unlikely, even when it seems impossible, sometimes happens. And when it does, it spreads. Every person she helped today would help others tomorrow. Every policy she implemented would create opportunities for hundreds. Every time she told her story, dozens of Patricius would be encouraged to try again. Elena Ramirez's legacy wasn't in the perfect translation of the contract, nor in the title she won, nor in the high salary she now earned. It was in the lives she touched, the policies she changed, the slightly more just world she was helping to build, one employee at a time, one opportunity at a time, one moment of genuine recognition at a time. And perhaps most importantly, she had proven to herself that surviving tragedy was not a shame. That rebuilding from the ashes didn't mean she had never been strong. It meant she was strong enough to get up again and again. 45 days. That's how long it had taken between Edward Alistair Brandt's cruel mockery and the complete transformation of Elena's world. 45 days that became legendary not because a janitor became a CEO, though that was extraordinary, but because a woman whom systems tried to make invisible refused to disappear. She translated more than a contract. She translated her own life from a language of pain into a language of possibility. And every time someone passes her now in the halls of Alistair Brandt Imports, they see her. They truly see her. Not in spite of where she's been, but because of the entire journey that brought her there. Elena Ramirez, at 52, thin, with deep brown skin that carried the marks of hard work, was no longer invisible. And she would make sure that no other person who pushed a cleaning cart, served coffee, or scrubbed floors was ever treated as invisible again. Not while she had a voice. Not while she had power. Because that's the only revenge that matters. To turn your own pain into protection for others. To turn your own invisibility into visibility for those who are still ignored. Edward Alastair Brandt had tried to humiliate her. Instead, he gave her the catalyst for a transformation that changed hundreds of lives. He thought he was making a cruel joke. He was, unknowingly, starting a quiet revolution of recognition and dignity. And that, in the end, was the true translation. From disrespect to justice, from invisibility to recognition, from humiliation to honor. Character by character, word by word, life by life. And you, how many times have you walked past someone pushing a cleaning cart without really seeing them? How many times have you ignored the person serving your coffee, assuming you know their whole story just from the uniform they wear? This story of Elena reminds us that every person carries a complete universe of experiences, knowledge, tragedies, and triumphs. Everyone deserves to be seen. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in justice and dignity for all, subscribe to the channel right now. Click that red button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next stories of resilience and recognition. Leave a like on this video so more people can find this message. The YouTube algorithm needs your help to spread stories of hope. And in the comments, write just this: never underestimate anyone. I want to see how many of us truly understand this lesson. Let's fill the comments with this powerful reminder. Share this video with friends and family who need to be reminded that everyone deserves respect, regardless of where they are in life right now. Important disclaimer: this story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, situations, or companies is purely coincidental. The names, characters, places, and incidents are products of the imagination or are used fictitiously. Our goal is to inspire reflection on themes of dignity, social justice, and human value through creative storytelling. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for watching to the end. Your presence here means you value stories about humanity, about how we should treat one another, about justice and deserved recognition. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember, truly look at the people around you. Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves to be seen.